So, talking about health is important to me. That's what I love about being a physician is to help my patients to be healthy. Even though I'm no longer young, I still work. God keeps me healthy and lets me take care of my patients. So, our title, as you can see, is God's Healthy Woman. Okay? Well, there's a new phrase that has become popular in the last few years, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. And that phrase is body, mind, and spirit. Now, the phrase, of course, is used to describe the totality of a person. However, 2,000 years ago, Jesus fully described the totality of a person when he said, as recorded in Mark, the 12th chapter, verse 30, that we are to love God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, with all of our mind, and with all of our strength. Now, the obvious meaning of that verse is that we are to love God with our total being. So, our heart is our emotional component. Love God with all of your soul. The soul is our spiritual component, and mind and strength. The mind is our intellect, and strength is our physical bodies. If we are to be totally well, we must be well in all four of those areas. If we are to be healthy, if we are to be fit, if we are to be all that God intended us to be, if we are to be God's healthy woman, we need to address the total person. Now, I have been told that in biblical writings, when a series of words or phrases are used, the word or the phrase that is used first is frequently thought of to be of the utmost importance. So, with that in mind, let's look first at the heart. And as we said a minute ago, the heart is our emotional component. And let's see how that affects our wellness. Now, you may be asking, well, isn't the heart the same thing as the mind? And the answer is no. The mind makes decisions. The heart feels things. Well, you might be asking, aren't emotions the same thing as the spirit? Again, the answer is no. Heart equals emotions. They may be good feelings, bad feelings, scared, sad, angry, happy, unhappy, sorrowful, or joyful. But they are feelings. And while it is true that emotions are very real, they are still feelings. So let's talk about it this way. Eve felt like it would be okay to eat the fruit of the forbidden tree in the garden. That's what she felt like. But what had God said? Well, God had said in Genesis, the second chapter, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So, what do I believe? My feelings or God's word? Well, I feel like God doesn't hear my prayers. I feel like God has forsaken me. But what does God's word say? Well, in Mark, the 28th chapter, verse 20, God tells us, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. That is what Jesus promised us. I just can't stand it anymore. I have too much stress. I just had a phone call from my sister, and she told me that my great uncle in Alaska had died. How well did I know him, you ask? Well, I didn't know him at all, but that's beside the point. He was somebody's uncle and somebody's friend and somebody's father and somebody's husband. And it just makes me upset to think about it. And that's not all she told me that's giving me stress right now. She told me that my third cousin out in California got a divorce. And I just think about it, how sad it is for their children, if they had children. But it just upsets me, something awful. And if you think that's not enough, and if there are not enough heartaches in the world, I want to tell you something else to think about. I want you to just think about the fire in Chicago. Which fire, you ask? Well, the one that burned it down in 1871. Just think of the horrors of that night. 1/3 of the city, 1/3 of the city, 1/3 of the city was lost, and everything that everyone had was lost. It's amazing those poor people ever had the heart to rebuild. And if thinking about that doesn't just rip your heart out, you're just cold. That's all I can say. Now, I chose those particular events, those particular scenarios to focus on because they are so obviously so very remotely removed from me. But don't we frequently do that? We get upset and anxious about things that we have absolutely no control over, and we let them consume us. Stress, emotions, feelings. I want to tell you a true story. I will always remember a very distraught patient that I saw several years ago, and I will use a fictitious name just to have a name to call her. Now I will call her Ellen. Ellen was 73 years old when she came to see me, and she was convinced that she was pregnant. She felt like she was pregnant. She was a lovely lady who had been a widow for several years. But now she was crippled emotionally with guilt because she had had sex with a man she had recently met. She cried as she told me that she had raised her children and taught her grandchildren that sex is for marriage. That's what God tells us. But now, here she was at 73 after having a sexual affair, convinced that she had morning sickness and that a baby was growing inside her womb. My reassurance, even after I did a pelvic exam, could not persuade her otherwise. So I did a urine pregnancy test. Of course, it was negative, but that didn't convince her either. I actually had to do a pelvic sonogram and show her that there was no baby growing inside her uterus. Now, my question is, did Ellen's feelings, no matter how strong they were, make her pregnant? No, of course not. But how often do we let our feelings dictate our lives? We feel worthless, lonely, hopeless, abandoned, deserted, scared, wronged, mistreated, and misunderstood. And those emotions happen in the daily lives of all of us at one time or another. But the question is, how do we react when we have those feelings, those emotions? So remember, emotions are only one part of our total being. And if we live in the light of our emotions, we cannot achieve total wellness. One of the greatest defeats in the life of a Christian is to trust what you feel over what God says. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, as we are told in Hebrews 12:2. Jesus didn't feel like going to the cross. The joy was what he saw on the other side. God had promised the resurrection. So I encourage you, keep your eyes on the promises of God. Now, I am so thankful that we have feelings. What a blessing that God gave us feelings. God gave us our feelings and our emotions. They are a part of our total being. Can you imagine how awful it would be if a bride and a groom didn't have feelings for each other as they faced each other and made their vows? Or can you imagine how awful it would be if a mother didn't feel love for her newborn baby? Or what a shame if you didn't feel anger when you witnessed someone wronging a little child. Those are good feelings that God gave us. Feelings are important, but feelings should not dictate our lives. Our behavior should be dictated by standards of right and wrong, standards of integrity, and standards of honor. Remember, feelings and emotions are only one part of our total being. And if we live only in the light of our feelings, our emotions, we cannot achieve total wellness. Okay? Well, Jesus said that we are also composed of a soul. Mhm. That's the important part. Our soul, of course, is our spiritual component. So, what is the soul? Well, we sing songs about it, we talk about it, but what is it? I looked up the definition in several different dictionaries and kind of got more than I bargained for in some of them. But the one definition that I think seems to fit our understanding and use of the word soul is the spiritual part of man. Now, since this lecture is about wellness, and not only wellness, but total wellness, involving the totality of our person, how do we know if our soul, our spirit, is well? Well, I will attempt to answer that question by first asking you a question. If you think that a healthy spirit is like God's spirit, So, if so, the best answer that I have found to the question, how do I know if my spirit is healthy, is found in Galatians 5:22 and 23. Where the Apostle Paul, inspired by God, tells us in that chapter that our spirit is well when our behavior exemplifies love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Those are the signs that we have a healthy spirit. Our spiritual health is dependent on how well we are nurturing our relationship with God. Many scientific medical journals have shown that being spiritually healthy can impact our physical health with lower blood pressures, longer lives, improved surgical outcomes, and hospital stays. In America, when I give this talk, I say, I think I'll get a letter of recommendation from my minister and send it to my insurance company and see if they'll lower my premiums. In serving God and others, we are able to focus on something greater than ourselves, and that helps us to keep our lives and problems in perspective. That is why it is so important to be spiritually healthy. Well, let's move on to another facet of our total being, and that is the mind, the intellect, our thought processes. And each of us have our own particular little IQ. IQ stands for intelligence quotient, how much we can kind of learn. Elise can learn numbers like crazy. I can learn things about your bodies. God gives each of us the ability to learn some things. So I'm going to use a silly little illustration to make a point regarding our minds, our IQs, okay? Imagine for a minute with me, if you will, 3 warehouses. Okay, those are to depict warehouses. Now, these 3 are all different sizes. They range from very small to a great big one. And we're going to pretend that these 3 particular warehouses rest on a receiving dock where ships come in and bring supplies. And right now, the dock is full of boxes that have just arrived. And those boxes contain clothing and food and tools and furniture for thousands of needy people. The only problem is if they sit out there on the dock, then the wind and the rain and the temperature extremes will damage some of the useful items inside those boxes. Now, there's actually enough room in those 3 warehouses for every single box, if all 3 of those warehouses are packed to their maximum capacity. Well, little warehouse 1 and little warehouse 2 say, oh, fill me up. I want to take care of everybody I can. Fill up my warehouse. But warehouse number 3, the biggest warehouse of all, who is capable of taking a lot of those boxes, says, you already put more in me than you put in warehouse 1 and 2, and I don't want any more. What a waste. The needs of thousands of people cannot be met because the warehouse that was the most capable of helping didn't want to. Now, the sizes of the warehouses correlate with different individuals' IQ levels. And ladies, that is how it is with us. When we do not use what God gave us, when we do not use the brains that God gave us to learn about our communities, the problems in our communities and what can be done for them, to learn about the ecological needs of the world, to learn about history and math and the arts. Our minds should be used to their maximum ability in order to make this a better world to live in for all of mankind. We should make decisions with our minds, not with our emotions. Okay? Remember, feelings come and feelings go. Therefore, it is important that we decide with our minds what we are going to do based on God's Word, based on what God's Word tells us is right and good and wholesome. Now, before we leave this subject of the mind, I want to use the illustration of the warehouses again, and this time for a different point. Now, as I said, those warehouses, those different sizes of warehouses corresponded to different IQs. Well, those warehouses that we looked at a minute ago were all well-structured warehouses that were designed to function as warehouses, to hold lots of boxes. And they correspond now to what we're going to talk about. They correspond to healthy minds, regardless if they were little or big, if they had an IQ of 80 or 240, okay? But now I want to talk about minds that are not healthy. And once again, I want you to imagine a group of warehouses. On the outside, they look just like normal warehouses, don't they? But on the inside, if you open them up, some of them are just mazes of little tiny hallways, and there's no storage space. And some of them, the flooring doesn't have any foundation, and it just falls when you walk in with things. Those warehouses represent sick minds or mental disorders such as depression, anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, multiple personality disorder, and schizophrenia. Now, just as, once again, some of them are little and some of them are big, and some people with mental health disorders have little IQs, some have great IQs. But, as we said, the internal portion of the warehouses were deranged and they couldn't be utilized. But let me tell you something. With the right carpenters and the right engineers and the right people to pour cement, those warehouses could be restructured into good warehouses again. Well, the very same thing is true with many of our mental health disorders. There are excellent medications and there is counseling to restore those chemical imbalances, and every effort should be made to allow each person to function at the level of their greatest potential. I use this as an example for that. Those of you who were here yesterday recall that my son developed diabetes when he was 13 months old. So that means his pancreas does not produce insulin. Now, it doesn't matter how good a Christian I am or how much I pray, that pancreas just doesn't produce insulin. So for him to live, he just takes a shot of insulin every day. Well, the same is true with some mental health disorders. There's some chemicals that are lacking. Even with very good IQs, there are some chemicals that are not in the right balance. And it doesn't matter how good a Christian you are and how much you pray, you need to get those chemicals right. And counseling and proper medication and proper exercise can help get those chemical balances right. So I was very impressed as I was preparing for this lesson today. I did some research on the internet regarding what might be available to the citizens in St. Vincent regarding treatment of mental health disorders. And I was delighted to read that in 2016, St. Vincent and the Grenadines had a nationwide initiative to improve the psychological wellness and mental health of the population. The Psychological Wellness Initiative is believed to be the first comprehensive mental health service of its type in the world. You ladies have things available to you, and if you or your family members or your friends have some signs that, I don't think the things are just right, let's seek help. And of course, a discussion regarding the mind would not be complete if we didn't talk for a minute about dementia. Dementia is the term that is used for a group of disorders that cause irreversible cognitive decline as a result of damage to brain cells. So let's just quickly look at some of those different types of dementia. So if you look up there, you'll see that some dementias are caused by vascular stroke, some are caused by Parkinson's, some are by some other little things, and the biggest percent is caused by Alzheimer's. But they're all different diseases that can cause dementia. And once again, seeking medical care is always appropriate to be sure the right diagnosis is made and to learn about up-to-date treatment. So let's move on now to our final topic in our quest to achieve total wellness. And that is the topic, of course, of our physical health. Now, obviously, in the time I have left, I don't have time to talk about all the things I learned in medical school, although it'd be fun. So let's keep it simple for a minute, because the first thing I want to say is prevention of a disease is always better than any treatment after that disease has developed. So, we want to talk a little bit about what we can do to prevent diseases. Immunizations are a wonderful example of one form of prevention. And I encourage you, whatever immunizations your country has to offer for you and for your children, always, always, always get immunized. Another important aspect of preventive medicine is having periodic health screening exams. Now, the frequency of various screening exams, such as pap smears and mammograms and colonoscopies, depends upon the age of the person and the particular risk factors. So, rather than debating the exact frequency of various exams, it is sufficient to say that there are many screenings, exams, and procedures to help identify disease states early and are important for obtaining optimal health. And again, as I was preparing for this lecture, I did some research on the internet regarding what might be available to the citizens of St. Vincent regarding health screening. And again, I was delighted to read that. Medical and health care encompass the services offered at all of the health facilities of the Ministry of Health, Wellness, and Environment of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Primary care is delivered at the 39 healthcare facilities, 1 polyclinic, and 5 district hospitals. And these services include antenatal care, child health, and chronic disease screenings. I'm going to tell you a personal example about screenings. Some diseases and some forms of cancers have a little bit of a genetic predisposition. And in my dad's family, there is a lot of colon cancer. So we all know that we need to get our periodic colonoscopies when our doctor says it's time. And so when my older brother, turned the right age, he had his first colonoscopy. And sure enough, there was a polyp that was precancerous, and they were able to take that polyp out before it ever turned into a cancer. Well, 3 years later, it was time, since he had had one precancerous polyp, it was time for another colonoscopy. He had his colonoscopy, and sure enough, there was another polyp that hadn't turned into a cancer yet, and they were able to get that polyp out before it turned into a cancer. Well, 3 years later, he was feeling great and busy, and he didn't have that colonoscopy done. And he was at his doctor's office for a bad cold one day, and his doctor was looking through his records and said, "Ken, you're late getting a colonoscopy." Kid said, "Oh, I know it, but I feel absolutely great. I'm having no symptoms of any kind, and I'll get around to that later." Well, about 2 months later, his sweet wife, my sister-in-law, called me and said, "I'm taking your brother to the hospital. He is sick with a fever and coughing." I said, "Okay, well, let me know how he is." And because they live in Fort Worth and I live 100 miles away in Eastland. And so she called me back and she said, "Oh, well, thank goodness. He has pneumonia and they're admitting him to the hospital and he should be well in just a few days." He did have pneumonia. Guess why he had pneumonia? He had pneumonia because he actually had a mass in his lung that was causing a pneumonia. And when the pneumonia cleared, they could see the mass in the lung. And guess where the mass in the lung had metastasized from? The colon. He lived 3 weeks from the time he went in to the hospital thinking he had pneumonia. He lived 3 weeks. And a colonoscopy to get rid of that polyp before it turned into a cancer would have saved him. Have your screenings. Your healthcare system provides that for you. Whatever your healthcare system provides in the way of a screening, get it. Okay? Okay. Okay. So now, prevention also includes some things that we need to avoid that are harmful to us. Okay? So I want to call your attention to a list of just a few things that are harmful to us as women throughout our whole lives. And time doesn't really permit me to have a big discussion of those things, but really, a discussion of them isn't necessary. It's rather obvious that these things need to be avoided. We need to avoid cigarettes. Let me tell you, I have precious patients, it breaks my heart, who are younger than I am, who have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease when they are in their late 50s from all the years of tobacco injuring their lungs. My father died from lung cancer from all the years of smoking. Cigarettes are harmful. Okay? We need to avoid those to be healthy. Obviously, ethyl alcohol abuse. Addiction happens in the life of every single person. For some people, addiction happens very quickly upon starting to use alcohol or other forms of drugs. For some people, it takes a long time for addiction to happen. But addiction is in all of our alarm clocks, okay? And for some people, those alarms go off after just a few months of drug exposure. For some people, it's a few years. For some people, it's several years. But the alarm will sound, and it's not pretty when it does. So we avoid it. If we just avoid that chemical, we do not harm ourselves with the addiction. And of course, besides the alcohol, there are the other drugs that are used. And then sex outside of marriage. Why sex outside of marriage? Well, because, first of all, God says sex is for marriage. Second, if you keep your body pure, if the person you are marrying keeps his body pure, when you come together in marriage, you're not spreading diseases to each other. Okay? So those are obvious things that we need to avoid. And what is something we need to be sure we do? Buckle up our safety belts. We always need to buckle up a safety belt. That is good and healthy. I have actually had patients who come into my office who say, Dr. Hazelip, will you give me a note excusing me from wearing a safety belt? Because it kind of hurts I have arthritis in my chest. No, honey, I'm sorry. I won't give you a note saying you can avoid wearing a safety belt. You have to wear your safety belt. Well, preventive medicine or preventive measures also need to be done during the prenatal period of time when that little tiny embryo fetus is developing inside a mommy. And there are scores and scores of things that are what we doctors say teratogenic. They are harmful to that developing embryo and fetus. Now, before all of you were born, but back when I can remember, there was a terrible thing that happened in the 1960s in Europe and to some extent in the United States from a drug called thalidomide. And you may remember this. It caused profound birth defects. Babies were born without arms and without legs. That was because their moms had been prescribed by their doctors thalidomide, not knowing that it was harmful. Okay? It's also well known that when a baby is developing, that if a mom has x-rays during that period of time, it can cause some problems with that developing embryo. So it's very important if you are barely pregnant and you need to have an x-ray for you to tell the doctor, whoops, wait, I'm pregnant. And he can make some things he can do some things to help prevent a problem. Another example for expectant mothers that can harm their babies is if the mothers become sick with rubella during the first trimester of pregnancy. That developing fetus is likely to have some abnormalities. So that is why it's very important for all of us to have those immunizations so that we take care of our babies. Another important area of preventive medicine that affects our well-being is, y'all aren't, Now you're going to say, oh, Dr. Sandy, you've stopped preaching and gone to meddling. Okay, that is proper nutrition. Okay, the nutritional status of an expectant mother affects to some extent the developing fetus. And of course, proper nutrition during infancy and early childhood is vital to the development of that baby. Those of you who were here yesterday heard me talk about the devastating years of the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia. Babies who were born during that regime who had terrible starvation did not grow to the extent that other Cambodians grew in other generations because of lack of nutrition. And proper nutrition continues to be of vital importance to a person's well-being throughout life because proper nutrition helps to prevent heart disease. Okay? Proper nutrition helps to keep us healthy. So what in the world is proper nutrition? Well, you all are blessed. You have lots of fresh fruits and vegetables. And another part of proper nutrition is not an excessive amount of meat, okay? And of course, not an excessive amount of fats and sugars. The goal of proper nutrition is to maintain a proper weight for each of us with regarding to our height. Now, proper nutrition has a very important friend to help keep the body in good health. And any idea what that good friend is? Well, of course, that good friend is exercise. Okay, proper exercise is a vital part of wellness. And once again, I said proper exercise. So if a person has been a couch potato for years, if they just lay on the sofa and don't do anything when they're able to, that person cannot suddenly get up and run 10 miles and shouldn't, okay? But we also don't want to keep lying on the couch for 10 more years. We need good aerobic exercise, moving our legs, lifting our backpacks. Okay, so I pray that I have given you some things to think about regarding being God's healthy woman. Healthy in heart, soul, mind, and strength. Because, why? What's the big deal? Because we are better able to serve the Lord through our service to others when we are healthy in heart, soul, mind, and strength. I pray that you ladies have learned something today to be God's healthy woman. Thank you.